Sand dome of the locomotive. Make sure that you've got plenty of sand for when you're starting the locomotive for traction. Another thing that you need to do is blow down the boiler. This is the blow-off cock on the fireman's side. Where the pipe enters is at the bottom of the firebox at a point which is known as the mud ring. This is where the sediment that's in the boiler water wants to collect before, and you want to blow the sediment out before you start running. In blowing out the boiler, check out where in the line of where the steam's going to go, make sure nobody is near there. They could get severely burned and injured. Open the cylinder cock. 5 to 7 seconds. Close for the same amount. Open for 5 to 7 seconds. Close. May have to do this 2 or 3 times to be sure that the boiler is blown down sufficiently. Make sure that the cylinder cocks are open. Check under the engineer's and fireman's seat. Make sure that you've got all your tools that you need. See that you have your engine oil can, valve oil can. See to it that you have water and ice for the engine crew up in the cab. Make sure that you have a torch, light bulbs, and fuses for lights in the cab, headlight and backup light, and the electric fuses that go in the box. See that you have red and white lanterns. Make sure that they're filled and ready to go. See that you have a copy of the current timetable and supplements. Now, once you had 180 pounds boiler pressure, your safety valves is lifted, double check, make sure that they work. You've got your steam generator on, all the lights in the cab are burning, your air pump's working, you've got air in the tanks and in the lines. Make sure that everything's ready to go. Check over, look at your water, make sure that that is full. Then what you would do, open the cylinder cock. Release the train brake. Release the full brake. Now the main train brake for number 9 is an A1 type. This is release position, run position, lap right here. Then you've got service application, and all the way over is emergency. Now just starting out, what you do is you release the brake. This pumps air from the tanks through the lines. This will release the brakes, and then once the brakes are released, you don't want to leave this on for much more than 25 seconds. Bring it back to the run position. 2 long blasts of the whistle. Your high ball. Make sure your Johnson bar is in forward full stroke. Look back along the train. and start pulling back on the throttle. Now as you start moving, get about 150, 200 feet, you can then close the cylinder cock. Now, while the engineer is running the locomotive, firemen be working the atomizer, the oil feed, keeping an eye on the water level. Good firemen will anticipate the movements of the Johnson bar and the throttle and adjust his fire accordingly. Now, as you're running, you want to have just a light gray haze at the stack. But in some of the films, if you've seen the Sunday River production of narrow gauge east of the Sierra, you'll notice a lot of shots of 9 and 18 with a lot of black smoke. What the fireman is doing is what is called forcing the fire a little bit. This is in anticipation of work that the locomotive has to do. Say that you've got a slight upgrade, the fireman will force the fire just ahead just a little bit in anticipation of the engineer pulling back on the throttle. Of course, as your water level drops as you're using steam, you want to open the injectors. Every once in a while, feed water to the boiler about the same rate that it's being used. Now, I'm going to give you a little test. See if you were paying attention. There are two kinds of students, sponge heads and sieve heads. I'm going to see who it socked it up and who it ran through. Now, when I operated the injector earlier, how many of you noticed I opened the top valve, or the bottom valve first, the middle valve, then the top valve. But on the video, I didn't close the middle valve. Now, if any of you caught it, congratulations, you were paying attention. For those that didn't, better wake up, grab you a cup of coffee. Now, as you're going along, you'll open up the sand box, get a scoop full of sand, you'd have a funnel that'd stick in to the peephole, and you'd pour the sand in there as the locomotive's working. What happens, the draft in the vacuum caused as the engine is working will pull the sand across the firebox into the flues and through the flues, sanding off any soot or carbon that builds up in the flues from black smoke. You want to do this because if soot and carbon is allowed to build up on the flues, it reduces the heating capacity of the locomotive, which affects your steaming. Now, too, as you're going along, say you've got to pick up some cars. Well, what you do is first you shut down the throttle, make a service application, take off about 10 to 20 pounds, depending on the length of your train. The more cars that you have, the more pressure that you're going to have to bleed off the line. Put it in lap once you're have reduced your pressure. Put your Johnson bar in full stroke. Open the cylinder cocks and glide to a stop. Now, while this is going on, like I said before, the fireman's got to be over there with the firing valve, adjusting the firing valve and the atomizer. Now once you come to a complete stop, one short blast of the whistle to indicate that you have stopped. Check back and see if there are any signals. You've got to, say you've passed a switch and you've got to pick up a car. You look back and brakeman or the conductor is giving you a signal to back up. So what you do, 3 short blasts of the whistle as a signal to back up. Pull the Johnson bar back into reverse. Release the brake. Put it in the run position. Watch back along the train. And notch your throttle out. Go back, gives the signal to slow down. You can close the throttle and make a service application, lap, and stop. And we'll show you how you couple up to a car. Now what the brakeman will do, take the lift lever, pull it up, and as he pulls it up, the knuckle will come out, and disengage, and open. Make sure that the airline is closed to the car you want to couple to. Now then he steps out and gives the signal for the engineer to back up, slow down, and stop. What will happen is, as the cars come together, part of the knuckle here will hit back in here, close, and lock this. Then the brakeman will signal the engineer to pull forward a little bit to make sure that he's got a coupling. If you don't do this and you've got the air hoses connected, what happens is that the line pulls apart and you put your train into emergency. Once you're sure that you've got a coupling, like I said, the brakeman, while the coupling is being made, he stands away and out from between the cars. Once the coupling's made, make sure that he's got a firm foothold. He'll reach over to the air hoses and glad hands, bring them up at a 90-degree angle, and then put them down. They lock. Then he'll open the air lines on both cars so that air can come in and charge the system. This is what the completed coupling looks like. Then the brakeman comes in, and opens the air hoses and allows the train line to charge. Signal is then given to the engineer that we can proceed. He'll answer with 2 short blasts of the whistle as an acknowledgement. Now on the narrow gauge, while you were still about a half mile away from before reaching the station, the locomotive engineer would pull 1 long blast on the whistle. This was to let them know at the depot that they were coming in. After the locomotive arrived at the terminal, switched its cars and getting ready to leave, engineer and fireman had backed the locomotive and tender down to the gallows or A-frame turntable, turn the engine around. Now this turntable
was built in 1883. 1889 it was taken apart and moved 20 miles north to Hamel, California. Then in 1903 it was moved back to its original site, where it was used up until abandonment in 1960. Once the locomotive was backed onto the turntable, the engineer and fireman would get out and they would push the turntable around. All the weight from the locomotive is carried on the turntable by 16 center rollers and axles known as a spider. In the latter days, an outside ring rail was installed and some wheels were added. This is so as the locomotive is being turned, if it's not properly balanced on the table would tilt slightly and the wheels would contact the rail, allowing the turntable to still be turned. Before this happened, if it wasn't balanced and you turned the turntable, the table would tip and you'd wind up with the locomotive in your turntable pit. After the locomotive was turned, it would back down the turntable spur back onto the main line. It would then connect up to its cars for the southbound run, come down the main line to the oil and water tanks. The water tank is closest to us, the oil tank farthest, and most of the time the locomotive would be filled down at Keeler or Oweno in later days. The oil facility was built in 1910, and the type of fuel, number 9 burn, was a number 6 or a bunker C, very heavy oil that has to be heated. If oil wasn't needed, then they'd pull up to the water tank and take on water. Now, for every pound of fuel oil that's burned, locomotive should evaporate about 8 to 10 pounds of water. As the train would leave the yard southbound, they'd pass this sign. What this is a speed board indicating speed of 15 miles an hour. Now, back in the 1930s, this speed board read 30 miles an hour on leaving the south end of the main yard. What you would do is, after the last car of the train passed this sign, the conductor or brakeman would signal the engineer that they were able to increase speed up to 30 miles an hour. It was reduced to 15 miles an hour. About mid-40s, what happened, the original rail in the yard here at Laws was 35 pound per yard and down the main line. And what happened, the Southern Pacific upgraded to 62 pound per yard rail from the sign north about up to where the A-frame gondola is in the main line. And what happened, you had a transition joint on a 3-degree curve. And the first time that a locomotive engineer headed southbound in this area, he just about tipped his engine over at the higher speed, so they reduced the speed to 15 miles an hour. We're now looking south along the old right-of-way. Just beyond the trees to the left, about 150 feet was the end of the 3-degree curve. Then the main line straightened out and headed down the valley toward Oweno and Keeler. As the train proceeded down the valley, there were a few places where it crossed roads. Simple wood railroad crossing signs were the only protection, along with the locomotive bell and the whistle as warnings. Now, once the train got to its destination at the end of the day, what they do after the brakes were set, throttle was shut, Johnson bar was put in the center or neutral position, what the firemen would do would be to close the firing valve, let the atomizer blow out some of the oil, then you'd blow out the burner. Next, you'd blow back into the tank, close your atomizer, close your blowback, close your blower, close the tank valve, close the damper, go out, put the stack cover back on the stack to allow the boiler to slowly cool, and you'd be ready to fire up the next morning. Well, that's about it. There's a lot more. All I've given you is some basics. There's a lot more involved in running and operating a steam locomotive. But hopefully this videotape has helped you out and taught you a few things. If nothing else, mainly think safety first in any railroad yard. Now, if you ever want to come out to the Laws Museum and visit us, we're located about 5 miles northeast of Bishop, California, off of Highway 6 on Silver Canyon Road. The museum is open from 10 a.m. to 4 a.m. daily. And hopefully, in a couple of years, we'll have Death Valley 5 at least operational, and some of the track restored in the yard, and we might even be operating back and forth in the yard on occasion. So, come check us out. We've got 11 acres. The depot, agent's house, turntable are built in 1883 and we're right where they were built. The water tank was rebuilt by the Southern Pacific in 1902. Oil facility, oil tower and oil pump house were built in 1910. And the tall water pump house was built in 1935. These were the original buildings in the Laws Yard, and then we've got several buildings of historical significance to the valley that have been moved in and have several displays. Come and join us, and thanks again.
I want to give special thanks to a few people that made this tape possible. To the Laws Railroad Museum and Historical Site, operated by the Bishop Museum and Historical Society. Friend and first teacher on steam locomotives, the late Frank Roush, good friend Joe Dale Morris, and Herman Darr.